The Musgrave Ritual story from Sherlock Holmes.
My friend, there was something peculiar about Sherlock Holmes that had caught my attention. Although his method of reasoning was extremely systematic and his dress quite meticulous, his habits in private life were so slovenly that they could drive a person sharing a house with him to despair. It wasn't that. Due to my own sensibilities, I was exaggerating Holmes's untidiness. After all, having worked under harsh conditions in Afghanistan, many things that would trouble ordinary people did not bother me in the least. But how sensitive could a doctor be who kept his cigars in the coal scuttle, his tobacco in a slipper, and pinned unanswered letters to the mantelpiece with a clasp knife? To my mind, target practice was something that must certainly be done outdoors. Yet Holmes was eccentric enough to enjoy firing at the opposite wall from where he sat. As one might imagine, these shooting practices left the walls and the air of the room in a dreadful state. The entire house was filled with chemical substances and remnants of crimes. We would encounter these at the most unexpected times and in the most unlikely places. Finding such things in a butter dish, or in even more inappropriate locations, was quite ordinary for us. But the real issue was the paperwork. He had an almost morbid fear of destroying documents. He insisted on preserving all records, especially those related to old cases. Yet the unfortunate part was that he only found the energy to sort and organize them once or twice a year. As I have recounted while describing Holmes's cases, he would work tirelessly while solving them. But afterwards such lethargy would come over him that he would spend entire days occupied with nothing but his violin and his books, too lazy even to rise from the sofa and walk to the table. As a result, months would pass and the house would become filled with piles of papers. Burning these papers was out of the question, and it was equally impossible for anyone but Holmes himself to put them away. One winter night, as we sat facing each other by the fireplace, I asked him if he had finished pasting the newspaper clippings into his scrapbook to spare 2 hours and make our home more livable. Agreeing that I was right, he rose and went to his room with a mournful expression. Shortly afterward, he dragged in a large metal chest. Placing it in the middle of the room, he pulled up a chair, sat down before it, and opened the lid. A third of the chest was filled with bundles of papers tied with red tape. With a mischievous glance, he said, "There are already enough cases here, Watson. If you knew what was in this chest, you wouldn't ask me to add more. You'd want me to take things out instead. So these are records of your earlier work?" I asked. I've been wondering about them for quite some time. Handling the bundles one by one, almost caressingly, he said, "Yes, my friend, these are my cases from before I became famous. I wasn't successful in all of them, of course, but among them are some fine little cases. Here is the Tarleton murder and the case of the wine merchant Vambury. This one concerns an elderly Russian lady's adventure. And here is an interesting case involving an aluminum crutch and the full account of the crooked-footed Ricoletti and his abominable wife. And here is something truly rare, a genuinely special piece." He reached into the bottom of the chest and pulled out a small wooden box with a sliding lid, like a toy box. Inside were a crumpled piece of paper, an old-fashioned brass key, a wooden stake wound with string, and 3 rusty metal discs. Seeing the expression on my face, he smiled and asked, "What do you make of these?" "An interesting collection," I said. "Very interesting indeed. The story behind it is even more interesting than the collection itself. So these remnants have a history. They are history itself." "What do you mean?" After placing the items from the box one by one on the edge of the table, Sherlock Holmes settled back in his chair and gazed at them with a proud expression. "These are souvenirs of the Musgrave Ritual," he said. He had mentioned this case several times before, but had never gone into detail. "I will be delighted if you told me about it," I said. With a mischievous smile, he replied, "I shall, but then we may not have time to tidy the room. Your tidiness does not trouble me too much, but I would like you to record this case as well, for it contains one or two unique points. Without them, the history of crime would be incomplete, and my modest successes would not be properly understood. I need hardly remind you of the Gloria Scott affair, and how my conversation with that unfortunate man turned my interest toward this profession. Today, both the public and the police turned to me as a last resort, but there was, of course, a beginning. Even when we first met in connection with the case you described in a study in Scarlet, I was already a man with certain connections of my own. Yet it is difficult for you to understand the hardships I endured and how hard I had to work to rise when I was still unknown. When I first came to London, from time to time, through my university acquaintances, certain cases came my way. My methods had already begun to attract attention in my final university years. The Musgrave Ritual was the third of these cases that came before me. Solving this curious affair brought me notice in a wider circle and led me toward greater cases. I had attended the same university as Reginald Musgrave. I knew him only slightly during our student days. He was not particularly liked among the students, but in my opinion, what others interpreted as arrogance was merely a screen to conceal his natural shyness. In appearance, he was the perfect aristocrat, thin, with a lofty bearing and large eyes. His movements were slow but dignified. Though he belonged to a junior branch of the Musgraves of the North, separated in the 16th century, he was nonetheless a member of one of the oldest families in England. The family residence, Holstone Manor in West Sussex, was perhaps the oldest house in the country still inhabited. His birthplace seemed stamped upon him. Whenever I looked at his pale, inquisitive face and his ever-upright head, I could not help but picture the decaying arches and mullioned windows of a noble feudal house. I recall that in our few conversations, he expressed great interest in my methods of observation and deduction. We had not seen each other for 4 years. Until one morning, he came to my rooms in Montague Street. He had not changed much. His clothes were fashionable. He had always had a taste for display. His calm and courteous manner, which distinguished him from his peers, remained the same. After we had shaken hands, I asked, "How have you been, Musgrave?" "You must have heard of my father's death," he said. "For the past 2 years, the management of the Holstone estate has been in my hands. I'm also engaged in duties on the county council, so I've been very busy. I understand that you now use those remarkable abilities of yours to earn a living." "That is correct," I said. "It is how I make my livelihood." "I'm glad to hear it, for I am in great need of your advice at present. Very strange things have happened at Holstone, and the police have been unable to make sense of them. Extremely curious and inexplicable events have occurred. You can imagine how excited I was, Watson. The opportunity one had been waiting for months had finally come to me. It was a case in which others had failed, and I felt certain I could solve it. I had been given the chance to test myself. "Please tell me the details," I said eagerly. Reginald Musgrave sat down opposite me and lit the pipe I handed him. "As you know, Holstone Manor is very old, and its repairs and maintenance are never-ending. Therefore, although I'm a bachelor, I have a large staff in my service. During the pheasant season, I also host parties as a sign of hospitality. In total, there are 8 housemaids, a cook, a butler, 2 footmen, and a boy for errands. The gardeners and stable hands are not included in this number. Among all these employees, the one who has been with us the longest is the butler, Brunton. When my father first employed him, he was an unemployed schoolmaster, but through his work and character, he quickly became our most valued servant. He is tall, handsome, and broad-browed. Though he has been with us for 20 years, he is only about 40. Considering his personal qualities and remarkable abilities, it is fortunate for us that he accepted such a position. I attribute this to his contentment with his lot and his lack of ambition. He speaks several foreign languages and can play almost any musical instrument. He is a man who leaves a strong impression on all who visit our house. However, this exemplary man is not without his faults. He is something of a womanizer, and as you can imagine, in a small place like ours, a man of his qualities does not struggle to attract female attention. While he was married, there was no trouble, but since his wife's death, he has not been at ease. A few months ago, when he became engaged to one of the housemates, Rachel Howells, we thought he would finally settle down, but he abandoned her and began an affair with the gamekeeper's daughter, Janet Tregellis. Rachel is a very good girl, but she is a typical Welsh woman with a passionate temperament. When Brunton deserted her, she fell into a fever and wandered about the house like a ghost. Until yesterday. That was the first tragedy at Holstone. The second was of such a nature that it made us forget the first, and it began with the dismissal of Brunton. Here is how it happened. I told you the man was very intelligent. That intelligence proved to be his downfall. His curiosity about matters that did not concern him led to our parting ways. I cannot tell how far this insatiable curiosity might go, but one day I happened to witness what he was capable of. You know that ours is an old-fashioned, sprawling house. Last week, more precisely, on Thursday night, I foolishly drank a cup of strong coffee after dinner, and sleep would not come to me. I tossed and turned until 2 o'clock, but to no avail. At last, I gave up, got out of bed, and lit the lamp. Since I was awake, I thought I might continue reading the novel I had been engaged with, but I had left the book in the billiard room. Throwing on my dressing gown, I made my way toward it. To reach the billiard room, I had to go downstairs and past the entrance to a corridor leading to the library and the gun room. As I glanced down that corridor, I was astonished to see light streaming from the open door of the library, for I had myself extinguished the lamp and closed the door before retiring. I thought a burglar had entered the house, and selecting an axe from among the many weapons that adorn the walls of Holstone Manor, I set down my candle and crept on tiptoe to the library door, from which I peered inside. There sat Brunton, fully dressed, in an armchair, studying a paper that lay upon his knees and resembled a map. His hand was pressed to his forehead, and he seemed deep in thought. He was not yet aware that I was watching him. The thin candle on the table cast enough light for me to see that he was completely dressed. Suddenly, he rose from his chair, went to a side table, unlocked it, and opened one of the drawers. Taking out a paper, he returned to his chair, unfolded it beside the candle, and began to examine it carefully. I watched this entire scene, frozen in astonishment. At last, my anger overcame my surprise at seeing him so freely examining our family papers, and I stepped forward. Brunton looked up and, seeing me standing in the doorway, sprang to his feet. He hastily thrust the paper he had first been studying, the one resembling a map, into his breast. His face had turned as white as chalk with fear. "So this is how you repay your debt of gratitude to this family," I shouted. "You will leave this house first thing tomorrow." Without saying a word, he bowed to me and walked past me out of the room. His pride was wounded. The thin candle Brunton had lit was still standing on the edge of the table. By its light, I examined the paper he had taken from the drawer, and I was surprised to see what it was. It was nothing important. Merely a copy of the strange questions and answers used in what we call the Musgrave Ritual. This ceremony is a symbolic family rite in which every Musgrave male participates upon reaching a certain age. It might perhaps interest archaeologists who study our heraldry and weapons, but otherwise it has no particular significance. We can return to the matter of that paper later, I said. If you think it necessary, of course we can, he replied. Very well, let me continue from where I left off. I locked the drawer with the key Brunton had left behind and turned to leave. To my surprise, Brunton was standing right in front of me. In an emotional, choking voice, he cried, "Mr. Musgrave, I cannot bear this disgrace, sir. I have served honorably all my life, but I cannot live with such shame. You would have my blood on your hands. For God's sake, I ask only this. If you will not let this matter pass as though it had never happened, then at least grant me a month's time so that people may believe I left of my own accord. Otherwise, I cannot endure what people will say of me." "You do not deserve such leniency, Brunton," I said. "What you have done is inexcusable. However, in consideration of your many years of service, I cannot bring myself to expose you to public disgrace. A month is too long. I will give you 1 week. Decide what you will tell people accordingly." "Only a week?" he cried in despair. "At least grant me 2 weeks." "1 week," I repeated firmly. "I can show no further indulgence." He bowed his head and withdrew in a dejected manner. I took my lamp and returned to my room. For the next 2 days after this incident, Brunton devoted himself to his duties with great diligence. I told no one of what had passed between us and gave no indication of it. I waited with curiosity to see how Brunton would conceal his disgrace. On the 3rd day, after breakfast, he did not come to me as usual to receive his daily instructions. As I left the dining room, I encountered our maid, Rachel Howells. I scolded her for returning to work before she had fully recovered, as she looked extremely pale and exhausted from her recent illness. "You need rest," I said. "Recover fully, and then you may return to work." She looked at me so strangely that I began to suspect something was wrong with her mind. "I am well, Mr. Musgrave," she said. "That is for the doctor to decide," I replied. "Now leave your work and return to your room. When you go downstairs, tell Brunton that I wish to see him." "The butler has gone," she said. "Gone? Where?" "He is gone without being seen. He is not in his room." "Gone, yes, gone." She burst into shrill laughter and threw herself about. Faced with this sudden fit of hysteria, I immediately rang for assistance. We carried the poor girl to her room, but while I investigated Brunton's fate, she was still crying out hysterically. Brunton's bed had not been slept in, and no one had seen him since he retired to his room the previous night. Yet it was impossible to understand how he had disappeared, for both the door and the windows of his room were closed. His clothes, his watch, even his money were all still there. Only the black suit he habitually wore was missing. His boots remained, but his slippers were nowhere to be found. Where could he have gone in the night, and where was he now? As you can imagine, we searched the house from cellar to attic, but found no trace of him. Our manor is extremely old, and its older wing is like a labyrinth. We searched every room and cellar thoroughly, but there was not the slightest sign of the butler. I simply could not understand how he could have left without taking anything with him. We informed the police, but they found nothing either. It had rained during the night. We examined the grass and the paths around the house, but it was all in vain. Before we had recovered from the shock of this event, a second occurrence made us forget the first. For 2 days, Rachel Howells' condition remained very poor. She suffered from fits of hysteria and lost control of herself. Indeed, we had engaged a nurse to watch over her at night. On the 3rd night after Brunton's disappearance, the nurse, seeing that Rachel was sleeping soundly, fell asleep in her chair. When she awoke at dawn, she found the bed empty. The window was open, and there was no trace of the patient. I was informed immediately. Together with 2 footmen, I set out at once to search for the missing girl. It was not difficult to follow her trail. Footprints began beneath the window, crossed the grass, and led to the edge of the lake. The tracks ended near the gravel path that led toward the fields. The lake is about 2.5 meters deep. You can imagine what we felt when we saw that the footprint of the disturbed girl ended at the water's edge. We immediately began dragging the bottom of the lake with nets, but we could not find her body. However, something quite unexpected was caught in our net. A sack filled with rusty, old metal objects and faded pebbles and glass. This sack was the only thing we found in the lake. Despite all our efforts, we could find no trace of either Rachel Howells or Richard Brunton. Although the police did everything they could, they made no progress. In the end, I decided to turn to you as a last resort. You can imagine, Watson, with what intense curiosity and eagerness I listened to this extraordinary chain of events, striving to piece together the fragments and reach a conclusion. The butler had disappeared. The maid had disappeared. The maid had loved the butler, but later came to hate him. The girl was a passionate and ambitious Welsh woman, and she had become greatly agitated upon Brunton's disappearance. She had thrown a sack filled with strange objects into the lake. All these were factors to be considered, yet none of them bore directly upon the solution of the case. What was the first link in this chain of events? Where lay the key to the mystery? I must see the paper that the butler examined, even at the cost of losing his position. Musgrave, I said. It is nothing important, said Musgrave. Merely a ceremony we perform for form's sake. I have the questions with me. You may look at them if you wish. He handed me the very paper you see here. It contained a dialogue in the form of questions and answers, which every Musgrave must recite before assuming his duties. I will read the questions and answers exactly as they were written. Whose was it? His who is gone. Who shall have it? He who will come. Where was the sun? Over the oak. Where was the shadow? Under the elm. How was it stepped? North by 10 and by 10, east by 5 and by 5, south by 2 and by 2, west by 1 and by 1, and so under. What shall we give for it? All that is ours. Why should we give it? For the sake of the trust. There is no date on the original document, but it is written in the spelling of the mid-17th century, said Musgrave. But I fear it offers nothing useful toward solving this mystery. At least we now have another mystery, I said, and one even more interesting than the first. If we solve one, we shall solve the other as well. Forgive me, but it seems to me that your butler was more intelligent than 10 generations of Musgraves put together. I don't understand what you mean, said Musgrave. I have never been able to make any sense of what is written there. To me, they are quite meaningful words, I replied, and I believe Brunton shared my opinion. He must have seen this paper before the night you caught him. That is very likely. We make no special effort to conceal it. I think that night he was trying to refresh his memory. For what I gather, the object he placed in his pocket when you caught him was something like a map or plan, and he was comparing it with this paper. You are right. But why should he be interested in this old family tradition? And what could this dialogue possibly mean? It will not be difficult to determine that, I said. Now, if you will permit me, let us take the first train to Sussex and investigate the matter on the spot. We arrived at Holstone Manor in the afternoon. You have no doubt seen pictures of this old and famous building, so I shall not describe it at length. The house is L-shaped. The shorter wing was built first, and the longer wing was added later. The date 1607 is carved above the low-beamed doorway in the older wing, but according to experts, the beams and stones are even older. The thick walls and small windows of this section led the family, in the last century, to move into the newer wing, and the old wing has since been used as storage and cellar space. The grounds surrounding the house are filled with magnificent old trees. The lake my friend mentioned lies about 200 meters from the house by the roadside. I was convinced, Watson, that there was not 3 mysteries, but only one. If I could correctly interpret the Musgrave Ritual, I had no doubt that I would find the clues to explain the disappearance of both Brunton and Howells. Therefore, I devoted all my energy to the ritual. Why had the butler been so eager to solve this ancient formula? He must have noticed something that had escaped the attention of generations of this noble family. He expected to gain some advantage from it. What could that be, and how is it connected to his disappearance? As soon as I read the dialogue, I realized that it described directions for reaching a particular place. If we could find that place, we might uncover the secret that Musgrave's ancestors had deemed worthy of preserving in such a mysterious manner. We had two clues to guide us, the elm and the oak. Finding the oak tree was not difficult, for on the left side of the road, just in front of the house, stood the largest oak tree I had ever seen. Can we determine where it stood? Of course. And are there any other elm trees? Not any old ones, but there are plenty of hornbeams. Let us have a look at where the elm used to be. We got down from the carriage before reaching the house, and without even going inside, my friend leading and I following, we went to the grassy spot where the elm had once stood. Its stump had been between the oak and the house. My investigation was proceeding well. I suppose it will not be possible to determine how tall the elm was, I said. I can tell you at once. It was 23 meters tall. I was astonished. How can you say so immediately? I asked. While my mathematics master was teaching trigonometry, he always made us practice measuring heights. At the time, I measured the height of every building and tree on these grounds. I was arriving at the information I wanted with an unexpected speed. Tell me, I said, did the butler ask you similar questions? Reginald Musgrave looked at me in surprise. Now that you mention it, I remember that 3 months ago he also asked me the height of this tree, saying that he had made a wager with the groom. What I heard pleased me, Watson. I was sure I was on the right track. I looked at the sun. It was descending, and according to my calculations, in less than an hour it would reach the top of the great oak's upper branches. At that moment, one of the conditions of the Musgrave Ritual would be fulfilled by the shadow of the elm. The extreme tip of the shadow must have been meant, otherwise the trunk of the tree would have been specified. What I had to do was calculate where the tip of the shadow would fall when the sun was over the oak. That must have been difficult, since the elm is no longer standing, I said. At least I knew that Brunton had managed it. If he could do it, so could I. Together with Musgrave, I went into the study and carved this stake you see here, then tied to it the string you see, knotting it at every meter. Then I took a fishing rod 2 meters long and went to the place where the elm had stood. The sun was over the oak. I planted the rod in the ground and observed the direction and length of its shadow. The shadow measured 3 meters. The calculation was very simple. If the shadow of a 2-meter rod is 3 meters long, then the shadow of a 23-meter tree would be 34.5 meters long, and of course the shadows would fall in the same direction. I measured the distance and found that it came up to the base of the house wall, and I drove in a stake at that point. You can imagine how excited I was, Watson, when I saw a conical hole in the ground just 5 centimeters beyond the place where I had planted the stake. Brunton must have found almost exactly the same point with his own measurements. I was following the man step by step. I took my compass out of my pocket and tried to determine the cardinal points. With 10 paces of my feet at a time, I went forward parallel to the wall of the house and drove in another stake there. Then I carefully took 5 paces east and 2 paces south. I found myself standing exactly on the threshold of an old door. To take 1 pace west would mean proceeding into the stone-paved corridor. This, then, must have been the place referred to in the Musgrave Ritual. I cannot tell you how bitterly disappointed I was when I saw nothing there. Watson. For a moment, I thought I had made some enormous error in my calculations. The setting sun shone upon the corridor floor, and it was perfectly clear that the stones, joined together with mortar, had not been moved for years. Brunton had not searched for anything here. I struck the floor in various places, but the sound was always the same, and there were no cracks or hollows. But Musgrave had begun to understand what I was trying to do and was at least as excited as I was. He took out the paper and checked my calculations, then cried out, "And so under? You overlooked the word under." When I looked at the word under, I first thought we would have to dig, but I immediately realized I was mistaken and asked, "Is there a cellar beneath this spot?" "Yes, and a very old one too. It is as old as the house itself. It is reached through this door." We descended by turning down the stone steps. My friend lit the lamp standing on the barrel in the corner with a match. At once we understood that we had finally reached the right place, and that we were not the first to come there recently. The place was being used as a wood store, but the logs, which had evidently once been scattered about carelessly, had now been piled neatly to one side, leaving an open space in the middle. In the center of that cleared area lay a huge flat stone with a rusty iron ring set into it. Tied to the ring in the middle of the stone was a plaid scarf. "Good heavens!" cried my friend. "That is Brunton's scarf. I would swear to it. What was that scoundrel doing here?" At once, at his suggestion, we sent for the police. In their presence, I tried to lift the stone by pulling at the scarf, but I could move it only slightly with great difficulty. At last, with the help of one of the policemen, I managed with much effort to slide the stone aside. All of us bent down and looked through the opening, which widened below, but it was so dark that nothing could be seen. When Musgrave lowered the lamp into it, we could finally make out what was there. It was a small square chamber, a little over 2 meters high and about 1 to 1.5 meters long. In the corner of the chamber stood a shallow wooden chest with its lid open. The strange old-fashioned key was still in the lock. The outside of the chest was covered with a thick layer of dust, and the boards had been riddled by damp and woodworm. The inside, too, was coated with a pale-colored mold. At the bottom of the chest were scattered a few old metal coins like the one I hold here, and nothing more. But at that moment, we were in no condition to think about the old chest and its contents, for all our attention was fixed upon the body crouched beside it. It was a man wearing a black suit. He was sitting with his forehead resting on the edge of the chest and his arms stretched out to either side. Because of the position in which he lay, all the blood had rushed to his face, and he was quite unrecognizable. But when we brought him upstairs, my client was able to say from the man's height, clothing, and hair that this was the missing butler. He had clearly been dead for several days, but there were no blows or wounds on the body that might give us any clue as to how he had died. We had found the butler's corpse, certainly enough, but the case still remained completely mysterious. I was greatly disappointed, Watson. When I arrived there, I had been sure that the moment I found the spot described in the Musgrave Ritual, I would solve the whole mystery. But although I had reached the place indicated in the ritual, I was still unable to uncover the secret that the Musgraves had guarded so carefully for centuries. I had discovered what had happened to Brunton, but I still could not determine how he had died, nor what role the missing woman had played in the affair. I sat down upon the barrel in the corner and resolved to go over everything once more with a clear head. You know my methods well, Watson. I began to think by putting myself in the man's place. Taking into account that he was highly intelligent, I reasoned what I myself would have done under the same circumstances. He had understood that something valuable was hidden in the place described in the Musgrave Ritual, and by making the necessary calculations he had found it. But when he realized that the stone was too heavy for him to lift alone, what could he have done? Naturally, he must have obtained help, but that helper had to be someone trustworthy. It would be safer to seek help from someone in the house, for the appearance of an outsider at the manor would have attracted attention. Whom could he ask? Howells had once been in love with him. Men never imagine that women will stop loving them, no matter how badly they may have treated them. By one or two little tricks, he had won the girl back over and made her his accomplice. At night, they would descend into the cellar and together open the stone cover. Up to this point, I had reconstructed their actions as though I had seen them with my own eyes. But the two of them could never have raised that stone by themselves, when the two of us, even with the aid of a large policeman, could barely move it. They must have needed some sort of support. Putting myself in their place, I looked around. There was plenty of firewood scattered about the cellar, but I immediately found what I was looking for. One end of a log about a meter long was badly bruised, and nearby were several other pieces of wood with flattened edges, clearly crushed by a heavy object. Evidently, after hauling the stone up a little, they had thrust the log into the crack, and finally, when an opening large enough for a man to pass through had been made, they had laid a log crosswise so as to keep the cover open. At that point, the entire weight of the stone had borne upon the end of the log, and that was why this part of the wood had been so badly crushed. So far, everything was logical. Now came the question of how the tragedy of that night had occurred. Only one person had gone down below, and that was Brunton. The girl must have remained above. Since the chest was almost empty, Brunton must have opened it and handed its contents up to the girl. What had happened after that? The man who had betrayed her was now completely in the maid's power. Could not this smoldering fire of vengeance within the woman have flared up again? In a sudden impulsive act, her Welsh blood aflame, she might have pulled away the piece of wood holding up the cover and buried Brunton alive. Was that indeed what had happened? Had the girl killed Brunton deliberately? Or had the support slipped by accident so that the cover closed of itself? Whatever the case, the woman had fled without looking back, carrying the sack loaded with her spoils. The muffled cries of her faithless lover and his frantic pounding on the cover must surely have echoed in her ears. The next morning, the reason her nerves were so shattered and why she laughed hysterically was probably what had occurred that night. The next step was to find out what had been in the chest and what the girl had done with it. The pebbles and old metal objects that Musgrave had taken from the lake must have come out of the chest. At the first opportunity, the girl had thrown them into the lake, hoping to destroy the last traces of the crime she had committed. For 20 minutes, I sat there without moving, pondering the matter. Musgrave, with his pale face, stood silently beside me, holding the lamp and staring down through the opening. Taking one or two of the old coins that remained in the chest, he said, "These are from the reign of Charles I. As you see, we had correctly guessed the date of the ritual's origin." The meaning of the first two questions of the Musgrave Ritual seemed suddenly to take shape in my mind. "We may find something besides Charles I," I cried. "Let me see the things that came out of the sack from the lake." We went up to Musgrave's study, and he spread the objects out before me. At once I understood why my friend had attached no importance to what had come out of the sack. The metals were blackened almost beyond recognition, and the stones looked extremely dull. When I picked one up and polished it with my coat sleeve, however, it began to glitter brightly in my hand. The metal had been worked in a twisted form, but it had lost its original shape. Turning to my friend, I said, "You should know that even after the king's death, the royal family resisted for some time, and when at last they were forced to flee, they buried their most valuable possessions so that they might return and recover them once matters had quieted down. Our ancestor, Sir Ralph Musgrave, was a devoted cavalier and the right hand of Charles II during his wanderings," said my friend. "Is that so?" I said. "Then we have found the missing link in the chain. I congratulate you, my friend. In tragic fashion, you have come into possession of a very precious treasure." Quite apart from its intrinsic worth, its historical value is immense. Speaking with difficulty from astonishment, he asked, "What is it?" "The ancient crown of the kings of England itself." "The crown?" "Most certainly. Think of the words of the ritual. Whose was it?" "His who is gone." That was after the execution of Charles I. And what came next on the paper? "Who shall have it?" "He who will come." That clearly refers to Charles II, whose return was expected. There can be no doubt that this battered and shapeless circlet once adorned the heads of the Stuart dynasty. But how did it come to be in the lake? "That question will take a little time to answer," I said, and I proceeded to explain the theory I had formed in my mind, together with the evidence for it. By the time I had finished, twilight was falling and the moon had begun to shine in the sky. Replacing the objects in the sack, Musgrave asked, "But when Charles II returned, why did he not reclaim his crown?" Now you put your finger on a point we can never be certain about. Most likely the Musgrave who had kept these treasures in safekeeping died before Charles II returned. And when he left this written guide to his heir showing how they were to be found, he gave no explanation of what it meant. Thus the secret was handed down from father to son until it came to our own day. Until at last someone arose who solved the riddle at the cost of his life. That, Watson, is the story of the Musgrave Ritual. The crown is now at Holstone Manor. However, in order to keep it in their possession, they had to endure lawsuits and pay a substantial sum of money. If you should ever go there, give them my regards. They will show you the crown. As for the woman, she was never heard from again. She probably crossed the seas to some distant land, bearing forever the burden of the crime she had committed.